All right. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you at the Croatian Parliament today. I would like to talk about central bank digital currencies and the threat they pose. Obviously, we have to discuss the economic pros and cons and benefits, but actually there aren't many benefits. So let's go straight into it. It's a fact that roughly 90% of central banks across the globe are presently checking out central bank digital currencies. This is from a McKinsey study. And of course, this is something that potentially could change the world and affect every one of us significantly. So it's something we should really consider in its implications. Now, first of all, what's new about central bank digital currencies, CBDCs? Well, we're being told it's the digital aspect. You know, the world is moving on. Paper money is really old. Everything's turning digital, so we need digital money. And that's also what, for example, the ECB has been saying. We need a digital version of the euro. There's Bitcoin, stable coins, blockchain. We need something equivalent from the central banks in Europe. But this narrative has a problem because actually we have been using digital money. You could call it bank digital currency. We've been using that for many decades. So it's not new. The digital aspect is not new. What is new about CBDCs? Well, what we've been using so far has been bank digital currency created and put into circulation by banks. And there are, of course, many, many banks in Europe. There are thousands of banks. And Germany alone has more than 1,500 banks. So a very decentralized system of putting digital money into circulation. That's what we've been using, BDC. So what's the difference to CBDC? Oh, it's the C, isn't it? The central part. We are talking about a project to centralize the issuance and the use of money, in fact, all of our money, because you see, bank digital currency, the digital money we've been using is actually more than 90%, maybe something like 97% of all money. And for transaction values, it is, close to 100% of the money that is being used in Europe and the Eurozone today. And so we have to really think about this because the only difference is the centralization. Now, what are the benefits, therefore, is the question of centralizing our money and allowing centralized control of our money. Our monetary system of the past 300 years really has been an interesting system that can be called a two-tier system, where the public deals with banks and the banks have the central bank. So it's like a pyramid structure with the central bank at the top dealing with only banks and banks only dealing with the public. And because there are many banks in Europe, thousands of banks, that's actually a good thing. And you can show that the more banks you have, the more economic growth you have, generally, and the more prosperity you have. It's because it's a decentralized structure. Decentralized decision-making structures are generally more stable, more reliable, more resistant to shocks, more resilient, and also they make for greater accountability, because the lower decisions are made in the hierarchy, the closer they are to the people, and the more they are actually decision makers are accountable. Any centralized structure, which really only makes decision at the top, is usually much more prone to problems, crises, and also resource misallocation as power corrupts, and centralized total power and control corrupts absolutely. And of course, we've seen this in the Soviet Union. We'll come back to that. So that's been the system we've had for 300 years, since we've had modern banking, a bit more than 300 years. And of course, the central banks have only been involved indirectly because their direct participation in the general economy as a direct participant to the public has been paper money, but they've issued this through the banks. The banks have always been the intermediary dealing with the public, and that's allowed the banks to maintain their role and the public to have some influence on the many, many small banks that we have in some countries, where therefore the monetary system is much more democratic and egalitarian. Cash, paper money, does not allow central banks and the central planners to monitor and control transactions. Banks do have this power, but actually, if you look at them for 350 years, they have not really abused that power. They've been in charge of digital currency, and that hasn't been a problem. There is no real problem. Most of all, they haven't used their control over digital money against us. They haven't sold our information as is being proposed by the central planners. They have not exploited this in any way. And that's because it's decentralized. There is competition. They couldn't really play up because they're competing against each other, you see. Now, what we see is the biggest attempt at a coup d'etat, at a takeover of the entire system of our society, in my view, in history. Central planners want to usurp this power of digital currency and centralize it to have totalitarian central control. And of course, the best way to illustrate this is to listen to this clip. You'll find it on the internet. I mean, the key passage is only less than a minute. Augustine Carstens, who's the managing director of the Bank for International Settlements, and what he said about this. Let me try whether this is going to work. I'm going to press here, and we're going to skip verification. And are you going to see this? I'm not sure whether you will actually see this. I hope you can see this. Here he is. Anyway, it's just a minute. Yes, well, he made it very clear. So what did he say? Let me just repeat. People tend to think that CBDCs are just like cash. I'm slightly paraphrasing, but you'll see. But cash, with cash, that means the central planners, the central bankers, he's speaking from the central bank perspective. Sorry, there's still something running here. I need to stop this in the background. Oh, it's the next central banker trying to tell us his reason why we need CBDCs. Okay, guys, it's my time now. We're going to talk about the dangers and threats of CBDCs. Okay, I've got to shut you down here a little bit. So back to Augustine Carstens. So what he said is, people tend to think CBDCs are equivalent to cash, but with just the modern update, digital version. But with cash, we don't know who's using the money. $100 bill today, a 1,000 peso bill today. We don't know who's using it for what purpose, and we can't intervene, I may add. Now he goes on. A key difference of CBDCs to cash paper money is that a central bank will have absolute control of the rules and regulations that will determine its use, and we will have the technology to enforce that. The technology, because CBDC is connected to the technology to enforce the rules that they make up, and they can make up the rules as they wish. They can initially be quite attractive, but they can later change it, you see. And that makes a huge difference to cash or bank money, of course, as well. So let's continue now with my presentation. So much for what the central planners have admitted. Remember, how did Justin Trudeau, the leader in Canada, end the peaceful demonstrations by truckers against restrictions of human rights and basic freedoms? They were going on for weeks, and the government really didn't like it. And so They stopped it because their bank accounts were frozen, their ability to buy food, medicines for them, their families were taken away. How did that happen? Well, they didn't have enough cash with them, you see. Cash is freedom, as it turned out, and no cash means no freedom and no freedom demonstrations. Their control over their digital money, which they had relying on the promise of digital money, that left them at the beck and call of the government, and the government said, no, we're going to cut off your money. The control over their digital money had to be, at that time, taken by the government through legislation, because we don't have CBDCs yet, you see. So they had to pass laws, which made it somewhat visible what they did, and is a bit embarrassing. And the laws were passed so that the government could tell the banks to freeze peaceful demonstrators' accounts. How did they know the names? Well, facial recognition. You see, we've got all this technology now. This is from the police report. The police froze 206 financial products, including bank and corporate accounts, disclosed the information of 56 entities associated with vehicles, individuals, and companies, and even, you see, Bitcoin, shared 253 Bitcoin addresses with virtual currency exchanges. And of course, there were all over the world, people were supporting these freedom demonstrators, peaceful demonstrators, through donations on PayPal. Sorry, you couldn't get access to that. They froze a payment processing account, PayPal, valued at 3.8 million. And that's how the truckers' demonstration ended all of a sudden. Funny that no such financial controls have ever been used, like for some criminals. I mean, these were peaceful demonstrators. What about serious criminals? Have they ever tried to use that against them? Oh, no, they haven't. Isn't that strange, you see? Now, since 2020, of course, the idea of digital IDs, such as vaccination passports, and the link to control and coercion have been advanced further. And digital currency, of course, allows a Chinese-style social credit score system. If you behave in a way the government doesn't like, you can be punished quite directly. And it's access to your money that will be the painful stick that will be used. And if you criticize the government, for example, your access to money could be restricted or taken away. So let's summarize. The digital aspect of CBDC is not new. What's new is that central banks are now stepping out of the shadows to rip up the centuries-old agreement, the concordat between banks and the central bank, to take on power directly, step into the retail banking arena, offer digital currency to the public, competing effectively directly against the banks, which would retail CBDCs would do. And of course, even if they start out with wholesale CBDCs, they can at any time of their choosing switch to retail. So that means central banks actually have a conflict of interest, and they're tasked to ensure good bank regulation, because they intend, as we now know, to compete against the banks, but they're also the regulators of the banks. I mean, a retail CBDC is simply a current account at the central bank. And so who needs the banks, you see? And the central planners, of course, they would prefer, and they will prefer, to then have everyone only use their account at the central bank. And you can easily ensure that if, for example, you have a banking crisis, which can be easily engineered, as most banking crises have been, by the central planners. So it's a bit like the referee in a football game deciding, well, I'm getting a bit bored. Actually, I'm a good football player myself. I'm going to score the goals now. And he joins the game while continuing to have the powers of a referee, to blow the whistle on everyone. Stop, you guys. I'm going to play now with the ball. Oh, I don't like what you're doing here. Yellow card. Oh, red card. Go off the field. Who's going to win that game? It's going to be the referee. Well, that's what central banks are doing when they say we want to issue CBDCs. So why are they doing this? What are their motives? The BIS now plan to actually expand this idea of central bank digital currencies to have a unified digital ledger that could usher in profound economic change. They themselves admit, the BIS being the central bank of central banks, the Bank for International Settlements. It says that all assets could be put under this new blockchain. All assets could be tokenized, digitalized, and therefore be subject to control by the central banks. This would allow, as they say, seamless integration of your ownership of your house and your assets, financial assets, non-financial assets that are tokenized. And you see here, key programmability allows the central planners to force their rules of the game on you. They have the technology to do that, as you just heard from the managing director of the BIS. Is this just a conspiracy theory? Well, no, it cannot be, because it's not a secret. It's out in the open and has been for a few years. The Bank of England has formally asked the British government to make a public endorsement of this decision to allow central planners, when they issue the CBDCs, to use the programmability feature, giving the issuer total control over how, when, for what, by whom the money is spent. So we see here really not just an assault on our financial freedom or our political freedom, as you saw with the truckers' demonstrations. We also see, very interestingly, this has not been discussed anywhere else before in public. And what they don't want you to realize, it is also a takeover attempt by the central planners at the central banks, which have become over the last half century independent from governments and very, very powerful and de facto unaccountable. But they're now attempting to take over and assume parliamentary powers, the powers of parliamentarians, like in the parliament of Croatia or any parliament in Europe and other countries introducing CBDCs, because programmability is essentially assuming budgetary and fiscal powers, which so far have been the prerogative only of parliament and parliamentarians, and we understand as the foundation of democracy. That is also at stake. It is actually literally a coup d'etat against all of us, even against the state and democratic institutions. So why haven't they rolled this out already? I mean, this seems really attractive for central planners and totalitarian controllers. Well, McKinsey, in its study, found that, there's some obstacles to wider adoption. Obstacle number one, there is no market value proposition. This is a way of saying we don't need this. Trust remains a hurdle as people question the motives behind CBDCs. Sometimes people suspect governments of aiming to monitor or restrict financial activities. Yes, that's what it is. But of course, it's not governments. It's actually worse than that. It's a bunch of unaccountable central planners that are not even democratically accountable as governments are or supposed to be. The central planners are not accountable through the democratic system directly at all. And so it's worse than that. And of course, there are technical challenges. There could be service interruptions, including planned ones. So the conclusion is what McKinsey already found: nobody needs CBDCs. Only the central planners want them. So that's how your pro and con, your cost-benefit analysis comes out. The bottom line is we don't need it. There are no benefits. So why are we getting it? Well, they're trying to make us get it because it serves the purposes of the centralizers. And then all sorts of schemes could be run, such as climate priorities. Anything can be an excuse. For example, a social credit score in general for good behavior, or carbon credit score. You've spent too much already on CO2 related activities. Sorry, your money is now not working anymore. You want to travel outside the 15-minute zone? Oh, sorry, your money's not working. It's not allowed. And I mean, the unlimited schemes are possible. So really, the obstacles the CBDC promoters, central planners find are cash and banks. They need to get rid of cash and they need to get rid of banks, and they will if they get their way. So we must stop CBDCs. It's really worth going out and having demonstrations outside central banks against these CBDCs. And central bankers don't have a thick skin, unlike politicians. They will respond. Therefore, we have a very realistic chance to change their minds if we show strong resistance. They have a thin skin. They're not used to public, direct resistance. So it is really worthwhile showing that against the central planners' proposals to have CBDCs. And that's my recommendation. We already found that the use of cash has been restricted in many countries, and also central banks have been on a multi-decade program to reduce the number of banks and actually lead the extinction of banks in the past 20 years. Draghi, for example, said on the record, there exist capacities in the banking sector in the Eurozone. The aim is to reduce the number of banks, particularly in countries that have many banks and therefore are thriving economically or have been in the past. So which country is doing well economically in Europe? Well, Germany's had the largest number of banks, and that explains why its economy has been so robust. Many small local banks lending locally for productive business investment. But they've reduced the number of banks in Germany, coming down to zero. Well, essentially the central bankers, when they get CBDCs, the number of banks will go down to close to zero. They will be the only bank in town who will get a Gosbank style system. The central bankers have created property bubbles, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, which have busted banks. They like that. They did it first in the periphery from 2005 to 2010, and then busted it and had a crisis. Then they did the same thing from 2009 until last year in Germany, huge property bubble, and some other central countries. Now that's going to burst. There's going to be a banking crisis 2 or 3 years' time. Anti-bank measures, the list is so long how the ECB and the EU have been working very hard against banks. PSD2 is an example where they force banks to divulge your information, which they've never misused so far, and give it to fintech companies just because you pressed the wrong click. I agree on some online thing, and now they have to give out your data. That's pretty outrageous and should be stopped as well. Central banks have been amassing ever greater powers in the past decades. They are the ones actually that have abused this power. They're responsible for boom and bust cycles. They've created inflation. The recent inflation was started with the central bank massively expanding money creation for unproductive consumption. And that's why we've had inflation. They did this in March 2020. The Federal Reserve was leading that. Other central banks had to follow. They blame it on other things like war. They did the same in the 70s. And actually, even the 70s inflation was created by the central bankers. Same story. They blame it on other things. OPEC embargo is not true. It's bank credit creation run by the central banks. That peaked already in early 73 in the US. In Germany, March 73 or June, and that caused the inflation of 74. There's a lead time, you see, the bank credit, whereas the war in the Middle East was only in late October 73, and then oil prices quadrupled in January 74, you see. It's too late. The inflation already peaked in Germany in the first half of 73, so it couldn't have been the oil shock. So the key policies of central bankers have been to reduce economic growth since the 70s, contraction of credit for productive purposes, creating asset bubbles, banking crises, and reducing economic growth. It's very bad what they've done. Growth is not the enemy of the environment. You can have high, sustainable economic growth without crises if you just make sure that bank credit is used for productive business investment. But the central planners have discouraged that through their policies. They've already killed 5,000 banks in Europe since the ECB took over, 20,000 banks in the last decades in the US. They don't like decentralization, they like centralization. They've created boom-bust cycles via encouraging property speculation funded by bank credit via the Basel Bank regulatory requirements. They've intentionally created inflations of the 70s and since the 21, 22 inflation. They've manipulated crises to argue for greater powers for themselves, which they have received actually, but they've abused that power. They've become more powerful than ever. We have to now step in and stop that. The power of central banks is really too large. Banks actually create the money. And if banks create credit for productive business investment, here the green box, you get high growth and no inflation. That's what we need. But central planners have ensured that money creation is used for consumption. That was March 2020 and also in the 1970s, you get inflation. Or on the left side, case one, bank credit creation for asset purchases. And that gives us, well, for many years, it can be a great asset boom. Lots of money is being made. Everyone is happy, but actually it's unproductive. You are causing a bust, a financial crisis, banking crisis, and then economic recessions. They've done this all over the world, 100 banking crises in just a few decades recently. My quantity theory of disaggregate credit has long demonstrated this, published in peer-reviewed journals. We need to avoid the recreation of the Gosbank, central bank, monobank system in the Soviet Union, which CBDCs will lead up to. So we need to stop this and step in. We need to actually create more small banks, local banks, community banks, and supports decentralization in money creation. So let's stop the introduction of CBDCs. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. CBDCs, too much power. And of course, watch out, because they're going to introduce digital IDs under flu virus pretense, or immigration. Now, Tony Blair is saying, oh, the immigration that he started or accelerated in England, we should now introduce digital IDs as a measure. Well, these are just excuses by the central planners. And therefore, let me conclude, we need to resist this and stop the introductions of CBDCs. Thank you very much.